creepy horror stories.
John dragged the final cardboard box across the threshold and let it drop with a satisfying thud. 3 days of backbreaking labor, countless trips up and down the moving truck's ramp, and enough takeout containers to fill a small landfill, but he was finally done. The house stood around him, no longer echoing with emptiness but filled with the comfortable weight of his possessions finding their places. He surveyed his new living room with tired satisfaction. The worn leather couch sat perfectly beneath the front window, his grandmother's quilt draped over its arm. His collection of vintage books lined the built-in shelves, their spines creating a familiar rainbow of faded colors. Even the small dent in the hardwood floor, where he'd accidentally dropped his desk lamp, somehow made the space feel more like home. But John had saved the most important items for last, his writing supplies. These weren't just tools. They were talismans. Each one carries years of stories, dreams, and late-night inspiration. His leather journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hours of use, the binding loose from being opened and closed thousands of times. A collection of perfectly sharpened pencils, each one whittled to a precise point. And most precious of all, a small purple eraser shaped like a cat that his sister Emma had given him for his 25th birthday.
For good luck.
She'd said with that crooked smile of hers.
And for all the terrible first drafts you're going to write.
John placed each item carefully on the kitchen table, arranging them just so. The journal in the center, pencils to the right in order of length, the purple eraser cat perched nearby like a tiny guardian.
Perfect.
Now he could finally get back to what mattered most. Through the sliding glass door that led to his backyard, late afternoon sunlight painted everything in golden hues. John stepped closer to admire his new outdoor space, and his breath caught. The yard was pristine. The grass had been cut to an impossibly uniform height, each blade standing at perfect attention. Red flowers. He thought they might be geraniums. They bloomed in meticulously maintained rows along the back fence, their crimson petals so vibrant they almost seemed to glow. A small oak tree dominated the left corner, its branches perfectly pruned, casting dappled shadows across the emerald lawn. The previous owner, Mrs. Henderson, had been a gardening enthusiast. During the walkthrough, the real estate agent had mentioned that the elderly woman had spent decades tending to this yard, treating it like her greatest masterpiece. She'd moved to Florida to be closer to her grandchildren, reluctantly leaving behind what she called her life's work.
This is perfect,
John murmured, already imagining himself writing at the kitchen table with this serene view as his backdrop.
Maybe I can finally finish that novel I've been thinking about for 3 years.
His stomach chose that moment to voice its complaint with a rumbling growl that echoed through the quiet kitchen. John laughed and opened the refrigerator, knowing exactly what he'd find. One sad turkey sandwich wrapped in plastic, and a lone can of Coke, the remnants of his moving day supplies. He'd been meaning to go grocery shopping, but exhaustion had won out over hunger for the past 2 days. He unwrapped the sandwich and took a bite, leaning against the counter as he gazed out at his yard. The red flowers seemed even more brilliant now, almost pulsing in the fading light. He'd have to ask the neighbors what variety they were. Maybe he could even try his hand at gardening, add his touch to Mrs. Henderson's legacy. That's when he heard it. A whisper, so faint he might have imagined it. Like someone speaking just below the threshold of hearing, the words are impossible to make out, but the intent is somehow urgent. John stopped chewing and held his breath, straining to listen. There it was again. Not his imagination. A voice, or maybe voices, drifting through the glass door. But the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the air itself was carrying secrets. John set down his sandwich and pressed his face to the glass, cupping his hands around his eyes to block the reflection. The backyard looked exactly as it had moments before, but something felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, the red flowers more pronounced, as if they were pulling all the remaining light into themselves. And then he saw it. In the very center of his perfect lawn, where only empty grass had been before, sat an object that made his blood freeze. A skull. But not human. This was something much larger, with long, curved horns jutting from either side like twisted branches. The bone was bleached pure white, as if it had spent decades baking under a desert sun, and despite the evening shadows surrounding it, the skull seemed to emanate its pale white. John's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe Mrs. Henderson had left it behind, some kind of garden decoration he'd somehow missed during his earlier surveys of the yard. Maybe a neighbor's dog had dragged it over from somewhere else. Maybe. But deep down, in the primitive part of his brain, he knew none of those explanations were true. That skull hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. He was certain.
What the hell?
John whispered, his breath fogging the glass. He slid the door open and stepped onto the small wooden deck, the evening air cool against his skin. The whispers had stopped, leaving only the normal sounds of suburbia. A lawn mower humming in the distance, children playing several houses over, the gentle rustle of leaves in the oak tree. But the skull remained. John walked slowly across the deck and down the 3 wooden steps to the grass, his bare feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. Each step felt like a small betrayal, disturbing the perfect symmetry of the lawn. He approached the skull cautiously, as if it might suddenly spring to life or disappear like a mirage. Up close, it was even more unsettling. The bone was ancient, pitted with tiny holes and stained with what looked like rust in the deeper crevices. The eye sockets were vast and empty, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was looking back at him from within those dark hollows. The horns curved elegantly, ending in points that looked sharp enough to pierce stone.
Where did this come from?
John muttered, more to break the oppressive silence than to expect an answer. He crouched down, studying the skull without touching it. There were no drag marks in the grass, no indication that it had been placed there by human hands.
The same place you're going.
The voice was dry and ancient, like wind blowing through a tomb. It seemed to come from the skull, but also from everywhere at once. John's legs gave out, and he fell backward onto the grass, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he thought it might burst. The skull hadn't moved. Its jaw remained closed, its empty socket staring blindly ahead. But John knew. He knew with absolute certainty that it had spoken to him.
This isn't real,
he whispered, scrambling backward on his hands and feet, grass stains spreading across his jeans.
This can't be happening. I'm hallucinating. Too much stress from the move, not enough sleep, bad sandwich meat.
His desperate rationalization was cut short by a new sound. A low rumbling that seemed to come from deep beneath the earth, as if something massive was stirring in the darkness below. The perfectly manicured grass began to ripple like water, and John felt the vibrations through his palms and knees. Then the ground began to crack. It started small. Hairline fractures spread outward from the skull like a spider web of destruction, but the cracks widened quickly, and dark earth shows through the breaks in the green surface. The rumbling grew louder, and John realized with growing horror that it wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, like a heartbeat. Like breathing. Like something enormous waking up. The first hand burst through the grass just 3 feet from where John knelt, skeletal fingers clawing at the air before finding purchase on the torn earth. Then another, and another, until dozens of bony hands were pushing up through the lawn, emerging from the cracks like the dead rising from their graves. But these weren't human hands. They were too large, the fingers too long, ending in black claws that gleamed in the fading light. Some were missing digits, others bore the telltale green stains of long decay. They moved with purpose, grasping and pulling, trying to haul whatever bodies they belonged to up from the depths below. John tried to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. Terror had turned his muscles to jelly, leaving him frozen in place as the nightmare unfolded around him. More hands appeared, then arms, skeletal limbs wrapped in the rotting remnants of burial shrouds. The smell hit him then, a nauseating mixture of turned earth and decay that made his eyes water.
Help!
John finally found his voice, the scream tearing from his throat.
Somebody help me! Please!
But even as he cried out, he knew no one would come. The neighboring houses suddenly seemed impossibly far away, their warm yellow windows like distant stars. The sounds of suburban life had vanished, replaced by the scraping of bone against earth and the wet, tearing sound of something pulling itself up from underground. That's when the hands found him. Skeletal fingers wrapped around his ankles with surprising strength, the bone cold as ice against his skin. John tried to kick free, but more hands grabbed his legs, his arms, his shirt. They pulled him down toward the largest crack in the earth, which had widened into a gaping hole that seemed to descend into absolute darkness.
Please!
John begged, clawing at the grass as he was dragged closer to the opening. His fingernails tore, leaving bloody streaks in the earth.
Let me go! I don't understand what's happening!
The skull's laughter was like wind through a cemetery, dry and hollow and utterly without mercy.
Understanding is not required,
It said, its voice somehow coming from the darkness below rather than the bone structure before him.
only participation.
The hands pulled harder, and John felt himself sliding inexorably toward the hole. He grabbed desperately at anything within reach. Clumps of grass, scattered stones, and even the red flowers along the fence. But nothing could anchor him against the supernatural strength of his captors. As he was dragged to the very edge of the opening, John caught a glimpse of what lay below. The hole descended much deeper than should have been possible, its walls lined with bones of every size and description. Human skulls grinned up at him from the darkness, mixed with the remains of animals he couldn't identify. And throughout the charnel pit, more skeletal hands reached upward, welcoming him to join their eternal congregation.
This is where they all end up.
The skull said, its voice now coming from multiple directions as more bone-white shapes materialized throughout the yard.
Everyone who tends the garden. Everyone who feeds the flowers.
John's scream was cut short as he tumbled into the darkness, the skeletal hands guiding his fall rather than releasing him. The last thing he saw was the perfect circle of evening sky above, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a pinprick of light in an ocean of black. Then the earth shuddered one final time and closed over him, muffling his cries until only silence remained. The backyard looked exactly as it had before, the grass unmarked and pristine. The skull had vanished, leaving no trace of its presence. Even the red flowers stood undisturbed in their perfect rows, their crimson petals gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. But where John had been pulled underground, something new began to grow. It started as a small bump in the earth, barely visible among the uniform grass blades. But as the days passed, it pushed higher, taking on color and form. A single red flower, identical to the others along the fence, bloomed where John had disappeared. Its petals were particularly vibrant, almost seeming to pulse with their inner light. 6 months later, the house at 1247 St. Peter Street went back on the market. Sarah Martinez, the listing agent, stood in the backyard with potential buyers, gesturing enthusiastically at the immaculate landscaping.
And this garden is absolutely stunning,
She gushed to the young couple beside her.
the previous owner was quite the gardening enthusiast. Look at how perfectly maintained everything is.
The husband, a software engineer named David, nodded appreciatively.
The flowers are incredible. What variety are they?
I believe they're a special hybrid.
Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure.
The remarkable thing is how quickly they multiply. When I first listed the property, there were maybe 20 or 30 plants along the back fence. Now look, there must be nearly 60.
She was right. The red flowers had spread significantly, creating an even more impressive display. They seemed to thrive without any care whatsoever, their blooms growing larger and more brilliant with each passing week.
It's like they're fertilizing themselves.
Sarah laughed, unaware of how close to the truth her casual comment was. The wife, Jennifer, walked closer to examine the flowers.
They're beautiful, but there's something unusual about them. The color is so intense, and they don't seem to have any scent at all.
That's the beauty of this particular variety.
Sarah said smoothly, though she'd noticed the same thing. Most flowers had at least some fragrance, but these were completely odorless.
Very low maintenance. perfect for busy professionals like yourselves.
As they talked, none of them noticed the subtle movement in the soil beneath their feet. The earth was soft here, softer than it should have been after months without significant rain. And if they had looked closely at the newest flowers, the ones that had appeared just last week, they might have seen that their roots ran unusually deep, anchored to something far below the surface. Something that had once been human. David was already pulling out his phone to call their real estate agent.
I think we found our dream home.
He told his wife, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they stood among the beautiful red flowers. Sarah smiled, already calculating her commission. She'd sold this house 3 times in the past 5 years, each sale going smoothly and quickly. Buyers always fell in love with the garden. She never mentioned how the red flowers continued to multiply after each sale, or how the soil in the backyard seemed to get a little softer each time, or how, on quiet evenings, she sometimes thought she could hear whispers coming from the ground beneath the beautiful, ever-growing garden. But then again, why would she? Business was booming, and the flowers were gorgeous. The garden would always need new caretakers, and the red flowers would always need fresh nourishment to keep their brilliant color.